Okay, welcome back. So in this tutorial, we're actually going to make a GET request to an API. I apologize over the last few tutorials. We've done a lot of theory. Technically, there is more theory we could do because we need to speak a bit about what a promise is. But I don't want to keep just talking about, what is an API, what is JSON, what's a promise, all of these things. I'd like us to actually just start writing the code now, just so you can see it. So what I did was I just Googled free APIs and I'm at this URL here. So we have this website. It looks like it's API Fini, I think. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But basically, it is a huge list of free or public APIs that we can use for testing. So this is us just learning how to make a GET request to an API for the first time. And crucially, we don't need to use an API key. Okay. So I scroll down and there's two APIs I like here. So there's this one called cat facts. You just get a random cat fact, okay? So basically, this is the URL endpoint that we're going to have to hit or talk to, as I often say. And some people would say perhaps a more useful one would be you could make a GET request to the Bitcoin API, okay? So feel free in your own time to have a look through those various APIs. Okay. So what I've done is inside of Visual Studio Code, I'm after just writing out some notes and I'm going to talk you through it. So in this tutorial, as I say, we're going to be writing our first GET request. Remember, a GET request is we're looking to get data from another source, a server somewhere, like we say. And what's going to happen is when we make our GET request using fetch, we're going to be returned a promise, okay? Now, a promise initially is in the pending state, right? And then eventually what happens is the promise either resolves or it rejects. So if a promise resolves, it means that everything has worked. We had a good internet connection, the API was working, it wasn't down, and our code was good, okay? Basically, if you meet all of the right conditions, if you send a GET request to an API, you return a promise, and eventually that promise will resolve. And if it is fulfilled, you then have access to the data that it sent back. A promise can reject, of course, as well, if something has gone wrong. But assuming everything works, these are the steps we're going to follow. So the first thing you need to do is decide, what API it is you want to talk to. So for example, do you want to get random cat data or do you want to get the Bitcoin price? So I've chosen to start off, we're going to get cat facts. So I've chosen the API and this is it says here sample API URL. So this is the URL or the endpoint we're going to use to make a request. So we're going to be requesting data from this endpoint, okay, or that API. So then what you do is once you've decided on your API and the endpoint or the URL, which I just showed you there, what you do is you write down the keyword fetch, okay? So see here, I've written fetch. Then you have parentheses, and inside of the parentheses, you just paste in the URL. So you notice there, I have an opening and closing quote. So therefore we fetch parentheses, and inside of quotes, we pass in our API endpoint, okay? Then what we need to do is chain on dot then. So we've seen method chaining before. We make our request, and then what we can do is use dot then, and basically we can log out the response to the console. Now, when you see the response, it's going to be in the form of JavaScript object notation or JSON. Not JSON, the person, hi Jason, but actually JSON. So not JSON, JSON. Okay. Now the problem with JSON, well, JSON is great by the way, it really is. It's very easy to read, but it's not actually a JavaScript object. It kind of looks like a JavaScript object, but it's actually not. So then what you need to do if everything works is you need to just add on another dot then, okay? And essentially, when you get your response, you call or invoke the .json method. Only then will you be able to then actually log out the data to the console. So just to recap, we use the fetch keyword, we have our parentheses. Once we've decided on our API endpoint, you paste that in. You can then chain on a dot then just to log out the response object to the console. But as I say, it's not actually a JavaScript object. It's actually in the form of JSON once the promise resolves. So then what we're going to do, we're going to do this piece of code first, just so I can show you it. But then what we want to do is actually use the JSON method to basically parse or get the data back in the form of a JavaScript object, and then we can just log it out to the console. So then what we're going to do, this will be the first thing we're going to do together, but then we're going to write this piece of code where what we're going to do is we're going to use the fetch keyword again. We have our parentheses, paste in our URL endpoint for the cat facts, chain on a dot then, and on our response, what we're going to do is we're going to then, on that response, chain on a .json method to return the JSON response to a JavaScript object, and then we'll chain on another .then, and then with the data we now have in a JavaScript object, we can then just log that out to the console. Okay, I'm going to try and make this tutorial as short and as concise as possible, and in the next tutorial we'll have a look at this again. Just want to slowly take your hand now and introduce you to these concepts. Okay, so let's actually do that. So what I'm going to do is just refresh the console, so we see there's nothing there. So let's actually write out the code together. So as I say, you use the keyword fetch, okay? We have our parentheses, and then what we need to do is paste in the URL, okay? So I'm going to paste in the URL for catfax. Just paste that in there. So now we've made the request, okay? But then what we need to do is we need to, of course, check to see what the response is. So what I can do is I can use or chain on dot then, okay? Dot then is a method, so it has parentheses. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to just pass in here a function, and what the function is going to do is just return a response to us. And then I just want to log out the response, okay? So let's just log out the response that we get. Okay, awesome. Let me just save and refresh. Okay, so what we've done is we've actually got a response, okay? But what you'll notice is we see here, it says it's of type response. We have the URL. We have all these things called cores and status 200, so headers. So what you'll notice is it is a response, okay? But like, it's not very useful, is it? So the good thing is we have a status 200, which means that everything has worked, but we have not actually got back what we wanted, okay? So in the sense that we don't actually see any cat data. And that is because what I spoke to you about a moment ago. You get a response, okay, but what you then need to do with the response is instead of logging out to the console using .then, you need to use the .json method to parse the JSON response into a JavaScript object. So what we're going to do here inside of the code here now, instead of just logging out the response to the console, on the response, what we want to do is call or invoke the .json method, okay? So what that will do is parse the JSON response into a JavaScript object. And then if I chain on a .then, okay, what we can do is we can just call this data, okay? And then what we're going to do is just log out to the console the data, okay, what we've actually gotten back. And now if I save and refresh, instead of getting this weird looking thing, we're going to get a fact. So we see here, a cat has 230 bones in its body, a human has 206. Okay, so I can't really read it all. Can I bring this across? There we go. There we go. Okay, so the fact is a cat has 230 bones in its body, a human has 206. A cat has no collarbone, so it can fit through any opening the size of its head. Okay, I did not actually know that. By the way, if I refresh the page, our code is going to run again. We're going to send another request, so we might get a different fact. The richest cat is Blackie, who was left £50 million by his owner. Okay, did not know that. Okay, so I'm going to leave that tutorial there. In the next tutorial, we'll talk to this again in more detail. But essentially the key points are, when you're looking to make a request to an API, you can use the inbuilt fetch in JavaScript, okay? You have parentheses, you paste in the URL endpoint that you want to hit, you can chain on a .then, and with the response object, what you can do is call or invoke .json to basically parse that JSON response object into a JavaScript object. Then you chain on another .then method, and this time for the data, you can actually then just log it out to the console. So a bit confusing when you first see it. So I'll see you in the next tutorial, and we'll talk to this again in more detail.